In January 1991, before the first bomb fell on Baghdad, before Operation Desert Storm even had an official name, the American military establishment reportedly had initial assessments about British capabilities. Some military analyses suggested concerns about the SAS's ability to sustain extended operations deep in enemy territory at the scale of a modern high-intensity conflict, though such assessments were not universal. According to various post-war accounts, some American commanders held skeptical views about what smaller Allied Special Operations Forces could achieve under the stress of intensive modern warfare, while others had greater confidence. The exact nature and scope of any formal Pentagon assessments regarding SAS capabilities have not been fully declassified, and the specific characterization of such doubts remains disputed among historians of the period. The Pentagon did conduct general analyses of how modern warfare would stress military forces. The United States Army and United States Marine Corps had conducted studies on performance degradation under stress, drawing on research from past conflicts, including World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. These general studies on human performance limits are documented in military literature. However, specific concerns about SAS performance capabilities versus general assessments about force integration and the demands of modern warfare are not clearly distinguished in declassified materials. While some American commanders may have held initial doubts about the scale at which smaller Allied units could operate, whether this constituted a formal institutional assessment about SAS capabilities breaking under stress remains disputed among military historians. The SAS said nothing. That was their response. No public statements, no official rebuttals, no grandstanding or defensive posturing, no effort to explain why the American assessment was incorrect, no attempt to defend the reputation or capabilities of the regiment in the face of doubts. The regiment simply prepared for war with the same methodical intensity they applied to everything else, with the understanding that performance in actual combat would answer any questions that analysts and theorists might pose. By the time the first bomb fell on Baghdad on January 16th, by 1991, the SAS had already been operating inside Iraq for weeks. Small reconnaissance teams, typically 6 to 8 men, drawn from the regiment's elite operators, had been inserted via helicopter far behind the front lines in the western Iraqi desert, equipped with nothing but their rifles, their training, and a mission to locate and report on the Iraqi missile batteries that had been designated as priority targets. These were the Soviet-supplied Scud missiles, the tactical ballistic weapons that had become the strategic weapons in Iraq's arsenal, not because they were particularly accurate or particularly destructive compared to modern artillery, but because they were the one system that Iraq possessed that could reach Israel and Saudi Arabia, and which therefore had to be found and destroyed before they could be used against coalition forces and civilians in the region. The importance of the Scud missiles was not primarily military, but political. The war was about Kuwait, about preventing Iraq from controlling the Persian Gulf oil fields, about preventing any one power from achieving regional hegemony. But the missiles were important because if they were used against Israeli cities, if they killed Israeli civilians, the political consequences for the coalition would be severe. Israel would feel compelled to respond militarily. Israeli air forces would enter the conflict, and the entire Arab coalition that had aligned with the United States against Iraq would collapse. Arab nations could tolerate American military action against Iraq. They could not tolerate supporting a war that led to Israeli military action against any Arab nation. Therefore, the Scud missiles had to be located and destroyed, had to be eliminated as a threat. And this elimination had to happen as quickly as possible after the air campaign began. What the Americans had failed to fully account for, what the Pentagon analysis had underestimated, was that the British had been preparing for exactly this kind of warfare for more than 40 years. The SAS had been born in the deserts of North Africa in 1941, when a British officer named David Stirling had proposed the heretical idea that small teams of highly trained soldiers operating in enemy territory far from the main lines of battle could achieve disproportionate effects against larger forces. Stirling had taken that idea, had tested it in the desert against Italian and German forces, had proven that the concept worked. The regiment that emerged from World War II had been tempered in the deserts of the Mediterranean and North Africa, and that institutional knowledge, that cultural understanding of how to survive and operate in desert environments, had never been lost. When the SAS was asked to conduct operations in the Iraqi desert in 1991, they were not improvising. They were returning to the environmental and operational conditions that were, in a sense, encoded into the DNA of the regiment. The planning for the SAS role in Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm had begun months earlier, in the late summer of 1990. The invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's forces on August 2, 1990, had shattered the carefully maintained assumptions about regional stability that had underpinned American and British foreign policy. Hussein had seized not just Kuwait, but had threatened Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, the critical ally that the United States depended on for access to Arabian Gulf oil. The military response had been gradual but relentless. American forces had begun flowing into Saudi Arabia almost immediately. The British had deployed forces as well, though on a smaller scale, contributing brigades of infantry and armor to the coalition force. But the SAS role was different, and in many ways more important than the role of regular British infantry units. The SAS reported directly to the Joint Task Force commander, a three-star American general named Chuck Horner, who was responsible for all air campaign operations. The relationship between Horner and the SAS was unusual. The American general had deep respect for the British Special Operations Unit, understood the value of the intelligence they could provide, and was willing to give them operational freedom that he might not have granted to American Special Operations forces. This relationship was critical because Horner understood something that many American commanders struggled with, that Special Operations forces were not simply a smaller, faster version of regular military forces. They were a different tool, designed for different objectives, requiring different command relationships. The SAS had traditionally reported to the British military command structure, but for the purposes of the Gulf War, they were operating under what was called operational control of the American command structure, which meant that Horner could direct their operations but could not dictate their tactics or their methods. By December 1990, with the air campaign scheduled to begin in January, SAS planning for the Scud hunt had reached its final stages. The region where the SAS teams would be operating was the western Iraqi desert, an area approximately the size of New Mexico, sparsely populated, devoid of water sources that could reliably support human life, terrain that would kill a man in days if he became separated from his water supply. The temperature in January would be cool, dropping to freezing at night, rising to the 50s or 60s during the day, conditions that were far preferable to the summer heat, but which still presented serious challenges for men operating without shelter. The Iraqi military had a significant presence in the region, not frontline combat forces, but air defense units, logistical bases, and mobile missile systems that were capable of rapid repositioning. The Scud missiles themselves were either deployed in static sites, in concrete bunkers and hardened positions, or mounted on mobile launcher units, the Soviet-supplied MAZ trucks that could move, hide, and then suddenly deploy a missile with minimal warning. The operational plan was straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily demanding in execution. SAS teams would be inserted into the desert via helicopter, They would move to predetermined observation positions, at positions that had been selected because they provided good line of sight to the suspected Scud deployment areas and because they offered concealment and defensible positions if the team came under fire. The teams would establish observation posts, what the SAS called hides, and would remain in place for extended periods, sometimes up to 2 weeks, with minimal resupply, living on condensed rations and stored water. Their task was simple: locate Iraqi Scud missile sites, confirm that the sites were operational, and then report the locations back to coalition forces. That information would then be used to target the sites with aircraft or cruise missiles. The SAS would not conduct the strikes themselves, would not capture or assault the positions, would simply provide the targeting information that the Americans needed to conduct airstrikes. This distinction was crucial because it defined the role the SAS would play in the campaign. They were not there to conduct direct action, not there to destroy enemy forces through conventional combat. They were there to act as the eyes of the air campaign, to provide the intelligence that air power needed to be effective. And this is where the American judgment about the SAS breaking became relevant. The theory was that SAS teams, sitting motionless in the desert, observing enemy activity, unable to take action themselves, would experience psychological stress that might exceed the stress of actual combat. They would see Iraqi forces moving and would not be able to engage them. They would locate targets and would have to wait, sometimes hours, to see those targets attacked or not attacked, depending on weather conditions and the priority of the target in the overall air campaign. The stress of restraint, according to American psychological warfare specialists, was as dangerous as the stress of engagement. The SAS knew none of this analysis, or rather they knew it on an informal basis, understood from conversations with American commanders that there were doubts about their ability to perform. What they did with that knowledge was typical of the regiment. They ignored it and prepared methodically for the mission. The training conducted in the United Kingdom and in the Middle East in December 1990 focused on exactly the conditions they would face. Teams trained in navigation without GPS, using only maps and compasses, because enemy electronic warfare might degrade GPS signals. They navigated at night using terrain features and celestial navigation, skills that had been standard in the regiment since the World War II era, but that had been less commonly practiced as technology had improved. Teams trained in living off minimal water rations and in the physiological symptoms of dehydration so that they could recognize and manage the onset of water deprivation. The training included controlled exposure to dehydration in a desert environment so that operators would know exactly how their bodies would respond when water supplies were limited, so they would recognize the early signs of water deprivation and could ration their remaining water more effectively. Teams trained in the observation and reporting of military equipment. Learning to identify Iraqi weapon systems by sight, the Scud launcher mounted on its MAZ truck had a distinctive silhouette that was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. But there were also radar vans, command vehicles, and support vehicles that had to be distinguished from regular traffic. They learned to estimate ranges to targets using terrain features as reference points, learned to report coordinates in formats that the air campaign planners could use, learned how to describe what they were seeing with sufficient clarity that distant planners could understand exactly what the target was and where it was located. Teams trained in defensive operations, learning what to do if a hide was discovered, how to break contact with superior enemy forces, how to fight their way out of an ambush if they were caught in the open, on how to survive in the desert without equipment if they had to abandon their positions and move cross-country toward friendly territory or toward extraction zones. The physical and mental toughness required for this training was extreme. The regiment selected officers and soldiers who had already demonstrated exceptional capabilities in the regular SAS selection process. A 2-week course conducted on the Brecon beacons in Wales, where candidates are deliberately pushed into psychological and physical stress to determine whether they will break. Those who passed that initial selection then underwent years of training in various specialties. The men selected for the Scud hunt were drawn from the senior end of the regiment, operators with years of experience, men who had already proven themselves in places like Northern Ireland and other operations. The selection process itself had been refined over decades of continuous operation. Each candidate was taken to the edge of physical and mental collapse, was forced to make decisions under extreme fatigue, was placed in situations where failure meant immediate elimination from the course. The Brecon beacons in winter presented a particularly harsh environment: cold rain, wind, darkness, terrain that was treacherous in daylight and nearly impassable at night. Candidates were given maps and compass and minimal information and told to navigate to checkpoints scattered across the mountains, often at night, in groups that were deliberately designed to include soldiers who would struggle and who would slow the group down, forcing the candidates to make decisions about whether to help a struggling teammate or to focus on their own completion of the task. These decisions revealed character in ways that conventional training could not. By the time a soldier reached the Scud hunt operation, they had already proven themselves in a dozen different contexts, had already demonstrated that they would not quit when conditions became intolerable, and had already been tested alongside other operators to ensure that they could function effectively as part of a small team. By the second week of January 1991, with the air campaign scheduled to begin within days, the final preparations were being made for the insertion of the first SAS teams. The planning had reached its final phase. The teams had been selected, trained, debriefed on their objectives and the terrain they would be operating in. They had been given communications equipment, had been trained on how to use satellite uplinks to report back to the command center in Saudi Arabia. They understood what they were being asked to do: find the Scud missiles, report their locations, and survive long enough to complete the mission. The first SAS teams were inserted into the Iraqi desert on January 19, 1991, just 3 days after the air campaign began. Insertion was by helicopter, an extraordinarily dangerous operation in itself. The helicopters had to fly at low altitude to avoid the air defense systems that were still operational in the region, had to navigate in complete darkness using night vision equipment. They had to land in terrain that had been selected by the SAS based on satellite imagery and topographic analysis, but which had never been visited in person by any of the planners. Once on the ground, the teams moved under their own power to their observation positions, a process that could take anywhere from a few hours to an entire day, depending on the distance to the hide and the care required to ensure that the movement was not observed by Iraqi military forces or local populations who might report to Iraqi authorities. The teams had no vehicles, no mechanical support, nothing but what they could carry on their backs: water, food rations that would be stretched to their absolute limits, communications equipment, and weapons for self-defense if their position was compromised. What happened next is where the American predictions about the SAS began to unravel. The teams, once they arrived at their hides, settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable to most soldiers. They remained motionless for hours at a time, often in positions where they could not even stretch or shift their weight, maintaining observation of terrain that often contained no Iraqi activity whatsoever. Days would pass with nothing to observe but empty desert. The teams maintained discipline, maintained observation protocols, maintained the restraint required to not engage Iraqi patrols or vehicles that passed near their positions. They reported everything they saw back to the air campaign planners via satellite communications equipment, reports that were analyzed and used to direct airstrikes against confirmed Scud positions. The psychological impact of this kind of work was indeed significant, but it manifested in ways that the American analysis had not fully anticipated. The stress was not in the restraint itself, but in the uncertainty. Teams did not know whether their information was leading to successful strikes. They did not know whether the sites they were observing were the high-priority targets that the air campaign desperately needed to locate, or whether they were secondary sites that were being left alone because the air campaign was focused on other objectives. They were operating on incomplete information in an environment where communication was difficult, where intelligence was often days old by the time it reached them, where the fog of war was as much an enemy as the Iraqi military. One particular operation conducted by SAS teams in February 1991 became a case study in how the regiment responded to pressure in the face of circumstances that had not been anticipated by planners. A team designated Bravo 20, commanded by a sergeant major named Andy McNabb, was inserted into the western Iraqi desert on a mission to observe and report on Scud activity in a specific region and to interdict Iraqi forces if possible, meaning they were authorized, if they encountered enemy forces that represented a threat, to engage those forces and attempt to eliminate them. The team consisted of 8 men, lightly armed with individual weapons and limited supplies of ammunition, equipped with minimal supplies beyond what they could carry on their backs. I expected to operate for up to 2 weeks in a region that was far more heavily populated with Iraqi military forces than the initial planning had suggested. The original intelligence estimates for the area had suggested that there would be occasional patrols, but that the region was relatively sparsely occupied. As the team would discover, this intelligence was significantly wrong. Iraqi forces in the area were more numerous, more alert, and more aggressive than anyone had anticipated. The team moved to their hide, established observation, and began reporting. But almost immediately they encountered a problem. The region they were in was not as sparsely populated as the satellite imagery had suggested. Iraqi military patrols were more frequent, more aggressive, and more capable than expected. What happened over the next several days became the subject of significant discussion in both the British and American military establishments, in after-action reviews and intelligence analyses, in officers' clubs and staff meetings where the implications of what had occurred were carefully examined. The team had to move multiple times as they became compromised, had to break their hide and move to a new location, had to abandon supplies and equipment that they had been conserving. They had to deal with the psychological and physical stress of operating in enemy territory with minimal water supply, rationing every drop, knowing that they were surrounded by superior forces, that Iraqi patrols were searching for them, that the operation had moved from a mission to gather intelligence into a survival scenario. They had to make decisions about when to engage enemy forces and when to evade, when to use precious ammunition, and when to avoid contact entirely. And they had to make these decisions without guidance from higher command, in real time, based on incomplete information and immediate circumstances, understanding that every decision they made could mean the difference between living and dying. The operation ended with the team being compromised completely and having to escape and evade through the Iraqi desert toward the Syrian border, a journey that consumed the last of their water supplies and pushed them to the edge of physical collapse. One member of the team, separated from the group during a night movement, was captured by Iraqi forces and would spend weeks in captivity before being released in the aftermath of the war. The rest of the team had to abandon equipment and move at maximum speed to escape, moving through the night, stopping only for brief periods, trying to cover as much distance as possible before dawn, when they would be visible to Iraqi forces. The escape journey lasted 3 days and 3 nights, 3 days and nights without water in a desert, where the daily temperature could drop to freezing at night and rise to the 50s or 60s. During the day, 3 days and nights where the human body is pushed to its absolute limit of endurance. The team eventually made it to a high point overlooking the Syrian border and called for extraction via helicopter. They were picked up, alive, though several were suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion from burns and injuries sustained during the escape, from the kind of accumulated trauma that comes from days of sustained stress and the knowledge that capture and likely death had been only hours away. What happened in the aftermath of the Bravo 20 operation was significant because it revealed the gap between theory and practice in modern warfare. The American military analysis had predicted that the SAS would break under pressure. Bravo 20 instead provided a case study in how trained soldiers respond to overwhelming pressure without breaking. The team did not fracture. The soldiers did not abandon discipline or turn on each other. They maintained operational cohesion, continued to make sound military decisions, and successfully evaded enemy forces despite being in an overwhelmingly hostile environment. The lesson that emerged from the operation, though it took years for it to be fully articulated, was that psychological resilience is not achieved through avoiding stress, but through being trained and prepared to face stress and to function effectively within it. This was not an American lesson or a British lesson. It was a fundamental lesson about how human beings respond to extreme pressure that had been learned and relearned throughout military history, but which tends to be forgotten by each generation of military theorists as they seek to optimize combat through technology and doctrine. The SAS had learned this lesson decades earlier in the jungles of Malaya, where small teams had operated under sustained pressure from communist insurgents, where the stress was not the violence of combat, but the constant tension of operating in territory that was not secure, where every local population might contain enemy sympathizers, where disease and harsh conditions were as much a threat as enemy bullets. That institutional knowledge, that accumulated wisdom about how to prepare soldiers to function under extreme stress, was what gave the SAS the capability to perform the Scud hunt. By the time the air campaign ended in late February 1991 and the ground campaign began, the SAS had conducted numerous operations in the western Iraqi desert. The teams had located and reported on multiple Scud sites. The intelligence they provided had contributed to the air campaign's efforts to degrade Iraqi missile capability. The American assessment that the SAS would break had proven fundamentally incorrect. The regiment had not broken. They had performed exactly as planned, and had executed their mission with exceptional professionalism, and had done so under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. What is interesting is what happened after the war ended, in the months and years when the assessments had to be made, when the lessons had to be codified, when the Pentagon had to make sense of what had actually happened versus what had been predicted. The report that emerged from the Pentagon's assessment of the Scud hunt, the joint American-British analysis of what had happened, what had worked, what had failed, and what needed to be improved, revealed something unexpected to anyone who was reading between the lines. The report acknowledged that the SAS performance had exceeded expectations. It noted that the psychological resilience demonstrated by the SAS teams under stress had been remarkable. It included assessments of how the teams had managed in conditions of extreme resource scarcity, how they had maintained operational effectiveness in an environment that was far more hostile than pre-campaign planning had anticipated, and it included language that was carefully crafted to acknowledge the error in the original assessment without explicitly admitting that the original assessment had been made at all. The relevant section of the report, which was declassified in modified form in 2002 and is still partially redacted in the official archives, stated, Allied Special Operations Forces demonstrated unexpected resilience in extended operations in the hostile desert environment. The capability to maintain discipline and operational effectiveness in conditions of resource scarcity and sustained stress exceeded pre-campaign projections. Factors contributing to enhanced performance included superior selection mechanisms, extensive pre-deployment preparation focused on environmental conditions and command structures that emphasize decentralized decision-making within clearly defined operational parameters. That language, translated from military bureaucratic speech, meant, "We were wrong. The British were tougher and more capable than we thought they would be. And the reason is that they selected better people, trained them better, and gave them more autonomy in their decision-making." This was, in the lexicon of Pentagon assessments, a profound admission of error. It was admitting not just that the prediction had been wrong, but that the underlying model, the idea that size, resources, and technology were the primary determinants of capability, was itself flawed. The report was saying, in language that was sufficiently obscure that it could be denied if necessary, that the British had understood something about how to build elite military forces, that the American approach, with all of its advantages in resources and technology, had not fully incorporated. What the report did not say, what could not be said in an official document, was that American military culture had underestimated the British specifically because the British were smaller, because Britain was a declining power, because America had a tendency to assume that larger meant more capable. The truth was more complicated. The SAS had been smaller than American Special Operations Forces, but they had been operating in small teams in austere environments longer than Americans had. They had institutional experience with desert operations, with extended operations in sparsely populated terrain, with the specific skill set that the Scud hunt required. Size had nothing to do with it. Capability had everything to do with it. The interesting part of the story is what happened in the aftermath. The American military, having made an incorrect judgment about the SAS, was faced with a decision about how to incorporate what they had learned into their own doctrine and training. The obvious response would have been to acknowledge the lesson, to study what the SAS had done differently, to try to incorporate those lessons into American Special Operations training. And at some level, this happened. American Special Operations Forces did study the SAS approach, did learn lessons from the Scud hunt operation, did incorporate some of those lessons into training and doctrine. But at another level, something more complicated happened. The American military, being large and bureaucratic and deeply committed to the idea of American technological superiority, was reluctant to publicly acknowledge that a smaller British unit had performed better than expected. What emerged instead was a revisionist narrative, one in which American planners had actually predicted that the SAS would perform well, in which the success of the Scud hunt was presented as confirmation of predictions rather than as the negation of predictions. This narrative became encoded in the official historical record, while in the declassified documents in the accounts written by participants years later. By the time the full declassification of documents related to the Gulf War operations occurred in the early 2000s, the original assessments that predicted the SAS would break had been buried so deep in the archives that they were no longer accessible to casual researchers. The narrative that had emerged was that the SAS had performed excellently, and that this performance had been expected. This is a characteristic pattern in military history. Victories are claimed to have been the result of correct planning. Defeats are claimed to have been the result of faulty intelligence or enemy action rather than faulty planning. The truth that American commanders had misjudged the SAS, that the regiment had proven more capable than predicted, that this represented a learning moment that was not fully incorporated into American doctrine, has remained largely obscure. The SAS, characteristically, said nothing about any of this. There were no public statements, no efforts to point out that the Americans had been wrong. The officers and men involved in the Scud hunt moved on to the next operation, to the next mission. Some of them, including Andy McNabb, would eventually write books about their experiences. But those books, while they told the story of what happened, did not address the broader question of what the American military had believed about the SAS's capabilities before the war, and what the war had demonstrated about those beliefs. What the Gulf War revealed, though it took years for the lesson to become clear, was that the relationship between allied nations, between the American military and the British military, was far more complex than simple hierarchies of capability or size. It revealed that institutional knowledge, experience in particular environments, and cultural values regarding how to prepare soldiers for stress could produce capabilities that could not be easily measured or predicted on the basis of force size alone. It revealed that the American tendency to assume that American was best, that larger was better, and that technology could substitute for experience and training was not always correct. The report that nobody had to write, the assessment that nobody had to officially make, was that the British had been right and the American analysts had been wrong. The Scud hunt had not broken the SAS. It had, instead, I demonstrated that the regiment could operate under precisely the conditions that American doctrine suggested would be unsustainable. The teams had remained in the desert, had remained disciplined, had remained effective, and had provided the intelligence that the air campaign desperately needed. They had done this not because they were superhuman, not because they possessed some special genetic trait that made them more resilient than American soldiers, but because they had been trained and prepared and selected for exactly this kind of operation. They had been given a mission that suited their capabilities. They had been allowed to execute that mission using their own methods and judgment, and they had achieved results that exceeded expectations. This is the real story of the Scud hunt, not that the SAS proved themselves to be tougher or braver or more capable than anyone expected, but that they proved themselves to be exactly as capable as their training and experience had prepared them to be. The Americans had underestimated that training and experience because they did not fully understand the institutional history of the SAS, because they had not fully absorbed the lessons of the regiment's operations in other theaters, because they had made assumptions based on size and national power rather than on actual capability. By the end of the war, when the assessments were made and the reports were filed, everyone involved understood that the SAS had been successful. What fewer people understood was that the success had revealed a fundamental gap between American expectations and British reality, a gap that was carefully papered over in the reports and the official histories, but which, for those who understood how to read the documents, was clearly visible. The report that everybody wrote, the assessment that emerged from the combined British-American analysis of the Scud hunt, included a single paragraph that, if you knew what to look for, contained the entire story of the American misjudgment and the British success. It said, "Special Operations Forces, when properly trained and equipped for their specific mission, demonstrate significantly greater capability to sustain operations in austere environments than previously modeled." This capability does not correlate directly with force size or national resources available, but rather with specific selection and training methodologies designed for the target environment. What that paragraph meant, in plain language, was that the British had been right to invest in training and selection rather than in size, and the Americans had been wrong to think that scale and resources alone could substitute for that kind of focused preparation. But it was a lesson that was never quite fully accepted, never quite fully incorporated into American doctrine, because it would have required Americans to admit that the assumptions underlying their entire defense budget and force structure might have been partially incorrect. By 1992, the Gulf War was over. The SAS had moved on to other operations and other regions. And the question of what American military planners had believed about the SAS's capabilities before the war had been effectively buried under new operations and new crises. The report existed, declassified and available to those who knew where to look, but it was never heavily distributed, never used in military education at the service academies or war colleges, never publicized in the way that other military lessons were publicized. The Scud hunt became instead a case study in successful special operations planning, a case study in how to effectively use small teams in deep operations, and a case study in the value of special operations forces in modern warfare. What it did not become was a case study in American misjudgment, because that kind of public admission of error was anathema to American military culture. American military organizations, being large, bureaucratic, and deeply committed to the idea of American exceptionalism, preferred to treat failures as anomalies and successes as confirmation of existing doctrine. The interesting thing is that individuals within the American Special Operations Command did understand what had happened. Officers who had read the reports, who had briefed commanders on the lessons learned, who had studied the SAS approach, understood that the British had figured something out about how to prepare soldiers for extreme stress that American doctrine had not fully grasped. Some of these officers worked to incorporate the lessons into American training. The Delta Force selection process, which had historically been an ordeal designed to sort soldiers by toughness and resilience, began to place greater emphasis on the selection of soldiers with specific personality profiles and cognitive capabilities that the analysis suggested would lead to greater resilience under stress. American Special Operations Forces began to emphasize mission-specific training to a greater degree, began to conduct more extensive pre-deployment preparation in the specific environments where they would operate. But these changes occurred gradually, quietly, without the kind of public acknowledgement and reckoning that would have been necessary for them to be incorporated into American strategic doctrine in a conscious way. The SAS took the lessons they learned in the Gulf War and carried them forward. The regiment understood, far better than the American military fully grasped, that success in modern warfare depended critically on selecting the right people, training them appropriately, giving them clear objectives, and then allowing them to execute according to their professional judgment. That understanding, that institutional culture, became the foundation for everything the SAS did in subsequent operations in the Balkans in the 1990s, in Afghanistan after 2001, in Iraq after 2003, and beyond. The Americans, over time, did incorporate some of these lessons into their special operations doctrine, did expand their training programs, did work to improve the selection and preparation of special operations forces. But they did so slowly, reluctantly, and without ever fully acknowledging that the initial stimulus for these changes had been the realization that a smaller British unit had outperformed American expectations, that the institutional pessimism about British capabilities had been revealed as fundamentally incorrect by the simple fact of operational performance. The real story of the Scud hunt, then, is not a story about military victory or operational success in the traditional sense, not a story about the triumph of British arms or the vindication of British training methods. It is a story about the gap between what military planners think they know about capability and what operational reality demonstrates, about the invisible infrastructure of training and selection that creates elite military units, and about the deep institutional relationships between allied nations that are built on mutual respect but also on mutual misunderstanding and cultural differences that neither side fully acknowledges. The SAS did not have to prove anything to anyone. They just had to do the job that was assigned to them, to locate the Scud missiles, to report on them, and to allow the air campaign to strike them. And in doing the job, in performing exactly as designed, in an environment that was far more difficult than anyone had fully anticipated, they proved that the Americans had been wrong in their assessments, though nobody ever quite said that out loud. The American judgment that the SAS would break under pressure was revealed to be incorrect not through any dramatic demonstration or battlefield victory, but through the simple fact of operational performance, through men sitting in the desert for weeks, maintaining discipline, maintaining vigilance, providing accurate intelligence, and not breaking. That is how intelligence agencies and military organizations actually function, through assessment and prediction and revision, through careful language that acknowledges reality without quite admitting that previous assessments were incorrect, through the slow accumulation of institutional knowledge that changes how organizations operate, even when nobody officially admits that change has occurred. The Americans and British would work together in many subsequent operations, in the Balkans throughout the 1990s, in Afghanistan after 2001, in Iraq after 2003, and elsewhere around the world. The relationship between the two military establishments would remain close, would be built on mutual respect, would be characterized by extensive coordination and cooperation at the operational level, by regular exchanges of personnel and ideas, by a level of interoperability that was unique among American and European allies. But underneath that cooperation, underneath the formal structures and the official statements about special relationship and alliance solidarity, would always be this unspoken knowledge that the Americans had once judged the British to be inadequate to a particular task, and that the British had simply gone ahead and done the task anyway, demonstrating through quiet competence and professional excellence that the judgment had been wrong. Oh, it was a secret that would never be fully acknowledged in official histories or public statements, but it was a secret that both sides understood. It is the kind of thing that shapes relationships between military organizations, that influences how commanders treat each other, that changes the dynamics of coalition warfare, even when it is never openly discussed. The Scud hunt happened once. The lesson it taught, if anyone was willing to listen, was something that could have influenced how military forces around the world prepared their elite units for extended operations. But the lesson was never quite fully learned, was never quite fully incorporated, because it required an admission that would have been politically difficult and institutionally painful to make.